Thanks a lot for this opportunity to present this work here. It's been a wonderful lead-up of the topics we've heard about this morning to this topic. I feel a bit nervous because people were talking about plasticity of cognition, plasticity of various other things, and now you will see what we do. We talk about, if we assume these are kind of stable in midlife, then what? But then I hope you'll give me that pass as first order approximation, because what I hear also from Lisa's discussion, there's a lot of talk about plasticity, but maybe we don't yet know how to do it, and so maybe we get away with what we do in this paper. Without further ado then, so we study retirement trajectories and to what extent these are influenced, shaped by psychological factors. And as our starting point, there's great variation in these late in life work patterns in the population, a point very nicely made also in an earlier paper by Nicole, and a quick preview of what we'll be showing also in our paper. Less than 40% follow what one might call traditional retirement paths, that is from full-time work to full-time retirement, and the rest does something else. So 14% gradual retirement, there's unretirement, there are people who until age 70 still enjoy their work or whatever the reason, and then a few other patterns. So great variation, that's the starting point. And now, to what extent are these shaped by various factors? There's a great literature, of course, about the timing of retirement, having investigated the role of incentives, the role of health, wealth, job characteristics, we'll hear more about that, but fairly little about the role of psychological factors in this context, and so the motivation of this paper. And the psychological factors we'll pursue here, investigate, are cognition and personality traits. And both of these, again, have been, of course, discovered to determine or influence economic outcomes a great deal. Here you see a number of studies on the kind of things they've investigated: cognition influencing schooling, job success, welfare status, and so on. Personality traits seemingly, or not seemingly, predict mortality, divorce, occupation, smoking, health, and so on. Very fascinating, it seems. So we then want to see what they contribute to shaping people's retirement paths. So how might this work? And we, trying to organize our own thoughts, try to come up with some mechanisms that could underlie such pathways from psychological factors to retirement trajectories. Again, many other things affect retirement trajectories, of course. Here we're trying to isolate from psychological factors through some pathways to retirement trajectories, focus on that part. So one area would be preferences. So personality might influence, for example, what people enjoy to do, so their preferences being with family, or that it's important for them to be productive, being around others, and so on, obviously influencing then their preferences for work versus leisure. Then if we take these findings about the importance of personality traits to shape also health outcomes, then if there are people who take better care of themselves, they are healthier longer, they with that reduce the chances of health shocks. Also then, as they approach retirement, which then, if health shocks occur, take them out of the labor force, or if they don't occur, may allow them to work longer. And then again, there are interactions. For example, if my preferences are such that I really want to spend some more time with family, but part-time work would be fine with me. So these kind of things would also then influence my economic opportunities. Say, I love working, but it has to be part-time, but my employer won't let me. Then I'm limiting my own economic opportunities. If that's what I'm doing, let me get into that a little bit more on the next slide, so the other one wasn't so crowded. But if my career job doesn't allow me, for example, to go part-time, then I have to change jobs. That will give me probably a very different type of job. So I have to give up on my human capital that was kind of career-specific, and my other traits, my other more general human capital becomes more important. Am I a conscientious person? I deliver, those kind of things. Whereas the skill set that I had on my other job was important, but I cannot now monetize it anymore because I want to go part-time. And now it's, am I a good person? Am I reliable? Am I good with other people? Those kind of things suddenly may become more important. So those are the kind of things that we think might be plausible pathways of influencing retirement trajectories. So in summary then, that might mean Psychological factors, where we have cognitive ability and personality traits, those are the ones we start with, may make certain workers want to work longer, and then may make them, some of them more attractive to employers to keep certain workers, or some others to be more attractive to hire on their jobs. So, with that in mind, before we get going, still one step back, but why study things that, as we will argue in this context, are predetermined? Personality traits, cognition, people who are high cognitive ability. I know you've seen these nice graphs. The cognitive ability goes down with age. Don't you worry, we are aware of that. But the ranking of people, so high cognitive ability people tend to stay high cognitive ability, low, and so on, vice versa for low cognitive ability, and similarly for personality traits. So these things don't lend themselves to policy intervention very easily, short of course we heard the previous talk, us understanding how we might intervene, but so far it seems we're not quite ready for that, and not even knowing exactly how we would. But that said, if we found that these psychological factors are important determinants of, say, retirement trajectories, that's still important to know for policymakers. If there are areas, for example, what are the kind of incentives that would now matter or people would just not respond to, and who it is who would not respond because of these predetermined characteristics. Are there other policy levers or things sort of in the environment or institutional setting that might make it more attractive to certain types of people and maybe to stay in the labor force? And those are the kind of things we have in mind and why it's still important to find out. Okay. So in this paper, using data from the Health and Retirement Study, assuming you, of course, must all know that because I don't have time to talk about it, we take people, workers who are working full-time at age 56, and we follow them, all of them, for a 14-year window, and construct realized retirement trajectories, and then relate these to the psychological factors that I've mentioned. We also look at expected retirement trajectories. Realization, as you might imagine, shocks do intervene and make people move off what they had anticipated. So it's also interesting to look at expected retirement trajectories and then relate those to these psychological factors. And then, if we have time, we look at mechanisms as well. So there are a few papers that are very closely related to our work. I mentioned Nicole's paper already, and we also looked at both realized retirement trajectories and expected, and finds clear that they're closely related, so a very nice paper, and that it's not necessarily the negative economic shocks that cause any deviations. Most of these non-traditional retirement trajectories are actually expected. And Grisani et al. Look at labor market transitions, 2-year labor market transitions, and then personality traits, etc. Much shorter view of kind of retirement transitions. We really look at this full longer path here. And then Gwen Fisher with her co-authors also looked at perceived workability and some labor force outcomes and have an impressive set of psychological variables they bring to bear, so I'm expecting some good suggestions there. But now here, what we do. So our analytic sample is constructed as follows. We start out with 56 to 57-year-olds at baseline, where we pick them up, which is 1992, and the HRS 94, 96, 98. They're full-time workers at baseline, and we follow them for 14 years. So we want to have a fixed window. And you see in the graph below here then what is sort of the baseline for each respective one of these cohorts and the window of time that we then follow them. And in each person wave, we determine their work status. Are they working? Well, then full-time or part-time, taking information on hours. And if they're not working, why not? So retired, unemployed, disabled, dead, or other not in the labor force. We do that for these 8 waves that we follow them. Some people may miss a wave. In most cases, we can fill that with information from the survey, what they did in between, whether they were working continuously during that time or what else. And then once we have these unpronounceable strings that you see there for as little examples of 8 letters, we translate them into the retirement trajectories as you see on this slide. So firstly, the traditional one, full-time work to retirement. Then gradual retirement would be people who go from full-time to at some point part-time and then retire. Unretirement in our case is from full-time. At some point they have to completely withdraw from the labor force and then go back in some form or another, part-time or full-time, either one. Then we have people who stay in the labor force until the end of our observation window, as we choose it here, until they reach their 70s. They're still working, either full-time or part-time. And then a couple of other trajectories where retirement is preceded by either unemployment or disability. Note these outcomes here at the very bottom. Some people die before they reach age 70. And at least in this analysis, we leave them out because their choice of, say, unretirement or things like that was actually cut short. And so there's some censoring. Some people similar then left the sample. There's not much we can do. And then some few where there were some more longer gaps in between, say, when missing some waves of surveys where we couldn't quite fill it in. Very small sample here. We really managed to clean it up pretty much completely. All right, so, and here's then what you saw at the beginning, but now you have the background. We have some 2,600 observations, and the notable variation here in the user retirement trajectories is 38% go from full-time to full-time retirement, full-time work to full-time retirement. That's what we call usually traditional retirement, but then here you go. 14% gradual retirement, they go from full-time to part-time at some point, completely withdraw from the labor force. 17% go through a spell of unretirement, so through a spell of retirement and then unretire. And there are some 26% up there, I guess I could use this. Yeah, the 26% who, until they reach their 70s and are still working either full-time or part-time. And so this is, again, the kind of variation we want to be exploring here. However, one quick thing before we get to our psychological factors, are there trends in these trajectories? We would want to know that if that's in our data. And so I won't show you the details, but indeed, even in these very closely spaced 4 cohorts that we're following here, even there you already see trends towards working longer. And it's mostly in the fraction that that works full-time past age 65 and then retires. So that fraction is increasing. And then those who work full-time and then move to part-time. So we'll control for cohort effects and whatever else we show you later. But one thing that's notable, the fraction between, say, traditional retirement path, the one that goes from full-time work to retired, and the rest remains largely unchanged. All right. Now, psychological factors. We focus on the ones that are most widely used, and I'm sure we'll get some suggestions to expand this, but we focus on cognitive ability, and I'll tell you how we define that, and the big five personality traits. And cognitive ability here is measured by means of a 27-point scale, composed as the sum of immediate and delayed word recall. Thank you, Bob, for earlier introducing that. It was wonderful. And 0-7 subtraction and backward counting. And this measure is very closely related to fluid intelligence, the ability to problem solve, processing speed. And yes, it does decline with age, and we acknowledge that here too. But there is a fairly strong persistence by people by the time people reach midlife, and kind of the relative rankings, whether people are high ability or middle or whatever ability, cognitive ability. So what we do then to capture that is we age adjust and take repeated measures, not in their 70s or this kind of thing. We take the measures in their 50s and average them and then age adjust them. And with that, hope to capture that part of cognitive ability that's sort of the fairly permanent part. And then, yes, there are later on reversals, especially once people get sick. And we hope that we are staying still quite a bit away from this for most purposes using these scores in their 50s. All right. The big 5 personality traits, they are based on a battery of questions, 26 questions in the HRS, and are put together to develop scores on conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness to experience, extroversion, and agreeableness. So conscientiousness is pretty self-explanatory. Neuroticism tend to be the people who are worried about everything. Openness to experience tend to be people who need that intellectual stimulation. Extroverts want attention and social interaction, and then agreeableness seem to be the ones who look for pleasant, harmonious relations with others, say, spend time with family and things like that. And again, we have up to 2 values for people, take the mean, standardize. Quick word about the identification of our effects of interest. So as we argue the psychological factors, if we, as a first approximation, assume that they are indeed stable and don't change with time, and then that dimension of cognitive ability we've measured here also is largely stable, then these are predetermined factors with respect to all of the controls that we will be adding here. So they're exogenous to them in a statistical sense. And so when we look at the, say, regressions, we then regress retirement trajectories on first psychological factors only to get at their total effect. And then we add controls where we think of the controls of potential mechanisms, say health variables, labor market variables, and so on, where we'll talk about mechanisms a little bit more later. But it's through those that psychological factors can also operate. And so we'll see in the regressions then first the total effect of psychological factors, and then what's left after controlling for potential pathways, whether there's still something remaining. So that suggests the following regression framework. On the left-hand side is, there are some changes in the equations. But I'm sure you recognize you get the gist of it. But there's a nice, so, sub means arrow down. So on the left-hand side, we have, for example, a retirement trajectory, or the probability of working past age 65, various ways of measuring how long people work or timing of retirement and things like that. And then on the right-hand side, we'll have the psychological factors, and then a set of controls. These include demographics, gender, race, education, health indicators, self-reported. These are self-reported health, both at baseline at age 56 and then 10 years later. Subject probability of living to age 75. Then labor market variables, which of course prior literature has also shown to be very important. Here we control for occupations, the type of occupation, whether they have a pension, DB, DC, health insurance, and then marital status, again at baseline and 10 years later, and then wealth at baseline. And now let me walk you through an example of these regressions, a bit of a full slide, but let's focus on the first column where the left hand here, it's an all-else regression with on the left-hand side, whether somebody worked past the age of 65. And first we just regress that on the psychological factors and the cohort dummies. And we see then here the total effect of these psychological factors. Firstly, the 3 bold-faced ones are statistically significant at the 5% level. That is, cognitive ability increases the likelihood of working past age 65. Same for extroversion, but agreeableness does the opposite. Tends to make people less likely to work past the age of 65. And then in terms of magnitudes, these are standardized, so that means 1 standard deviation increase, for example, in cognitive ability would increase the probability of working past age 65 by about 5%. And the others are somewhat similar. Now, as we add controls, again, we're thinking of them as potential pathways through which, so say psychological factors impact health, as we argued earlier, then we bring in health controls, what happens? So health variables, if you see the third column now with the pink box now, we have added the health variables, and the coefficients on the psychological factors are reduced. So about, you see it at the bottom here, the fraction of the baseline coefficient explained by the added controls, have I shifted, excuse me, here, by the controls, explained about 20 to 40% of the coefficients in the baseline model. But the psychological factors still have additional explanatory power over and beyond that kind of channel, still significant, but smaller magnitudes. And then add controls and not that much changes anymore in this context. Now, let's look at a slightly different left-hand variable. This was working past age 65. Let's look at working full-time past age 65. And what's quite different here is full-time work tend to be very different jobs, especially at that age. more the career jobs that people have held on to, whereas the part-time jobs tend to be more the bridge jobs. So with that in mind, we see that cognitive ability still increases the probability of working full-time past age 65, similar as in the previous one, but extroversion no longer. Agreeableness is still there in the baseline model when we don't have other controls, and when we have sort of a total effect, but extroversion, as I said, is no longer significant. Then we had done all this work of coming up with more nuanced characterization of the retirement trajectory, but I tell you, looking at these multinomial logits is always a bit confusing, but I keep notching it up. But so now, looking at these other ways of retiring, or with more complex description of retirement trajectories, the base group here, the baseline group is full retirement, and then compared to them, what makes people more likely to gradually retire, unretire, always full-time to part-time. And some known friends here keep popping up. Cognitive ability, again, is statistically significant at the 5% level, makes people more likely to always work full-time or still work at age 70 part-time and not having retired in between, more likely to maybe still hold on to their career jobs. Extroversion, also helpful for that, relative to those who go from full-time to retired, but also much more likely and significant to unretire. Whereas agreeableness doesn't seem to help, in fact, makes people less likely to unretire. Now, these were realized retirement trajectories, and things may happen, move people off what they had intended to do, so it makes sense to also look at expectations. I won't show you the full details. We looked at quite a few of them, but in the interest of time, firstly, let me just say in words, we look at various measures of retirement expectations. They're all strongly predictive also of realized trajectories, of course, but however, with some discrepancies. But these definitely have important informative content. And let's walk through one example. The probability of working full-time past the age of 65 is one of the very important expectations variables in the HRS. We use the one that's measured as a baseline, that is at age 56. And the question again, do psychological factors explain retirement expectations? Same setup, left-hand variable, instead of realized work at age 65 is expected full-time work past the age of 65. And then related to psychological factors. First, just those and nothing else. And we see again, cognitive ability is strongly predictive and significant. Some of our other variables that used to be significant are not significant here. Nothing extroversion and agreeableness, but we have a new variable that now comes up here. It's openness to experience. And you see that here in the bottom line. And as we add controls, especially once we add demographics and health, the magnitude reduces somewhat, but it's still statistically significant. So what we then kind of make out of this, first of all, in terms of psychological effectors, they are predictive of both retirement expectations and realizations. And here are the kind of patterns, once we put it all together, that we have observed here. High cognitive ability predicts working longer, both in expectation and realization, but especially in full-time jobs. Extroversion predicts working longer, but rather in part-time jobs, in realizations, but not in expectations. And you could start telling stories here that clearly need follow-up. Extrovert people may not have anticipated working longer, but as they approach the time or now finally get sort of to retirement, they don't find it that appealing and consider going back to work. And some of you looking for some new experience. Agreeableness predicts retiring earlier in realizations, not expectations. You can tell a similar story, and some mechanisms that we did and look into, and that's in the paper, seems that agreeable people, they like to spend time with family. And one thing you can imagine is where they didn't anticipate retiring earlier, but as they get to the point, their grandkids, their parents to take care of, and in fact, those are the motives that they actually also predominantly mention. And they are then the ones who are more likely to say, okay, then I'll retire and take care of them or spend time with them. And then we have openness to experience predicts working longer in expectation, but again, not realization, and maybe some similar stories as I've told before. Again, some follow-up certainly needed. And now, so what do we make of all of this? As we mentioned, these factors that we've used here, psychological traits, cognition, don't lend themselves to policy intervention yet, maybe. But if we, for example, look at various mechanisms, say retirement attitudes, if we find that personality traits, cognition influence retirement attitudes, but only so much, then how much room is there, say, for information campaigns that influence people's retirement attitudes? Or if another channel is important, sort of again, see how much of that is shaped by personality traits and cognition, how much room is there left then for interventions? And another thing that was notable in the patterns we saw is that part-time work is an integral part of the retirement trajectories for a lot of people. About 40% move at some point through part-time work. And what we saw is that extroverts are, what should we say, more successful at having them, gathering them? Well, we can't quite say, but they certainly are more represented there. What about the others? Did they desire to work longer and get a part-time job, but they weren't as successful at it? Are there some ways how we can create environments where they might? But maybe we first need to find out whether they actually want to. Those are still open, all open questions. We did, in the paper, also do some work on the mechanisms, but again, I'm really running out of time. But we looked at retirement attitudes, we looked at job characteristics, health, and maybe let me just say psychological factors strongly predict all three of them. And there are then certainly also other mechanisms to follow it up on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gwen Fisher, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to be here with all of you this afternoon. Thank you, John, for organizing us and bringing us together, and to the Sloan Foundation, certainly, for support for this meeting and much of the work that's being presented. I am a psychologist, full disclosure. I'm a psychologist by training. Specifically, it's a mouthful, but an industrial organizational psychologist. So that is psychology applied to work settings. And I'm thrilled to see all of the work related to cognition and cognitive aging. It relates much to my own interests as well. So a little bit of background. I began working with the HRS in 2001. I was hired by Regula Herzog, who many of you know, and was one of the original co-PIs on HRS and a social psychologist by training. Very sadly, she passed away a year later in 2002. One of my original questions for Regula is, why are there not more psychological variables in the HRS? We had cognition, and that was about it. And I just want to say that if Regula were here, she would be absolutely thrilled to see that the HRS moved forward with adding personality and adding a number of other psychological variables to the study. So in terms of the paper, this was a really very interesting paper. A lot of work went into doing this. It was perhaps not fully evident, but the data management alone, to be able to construct these different groups of retirement trajectories, all of the data management in terms of doing the age-adjusted combining of everything, was a tremendous amount of work, and it seemed to be very well done. In summarizing the work, the paper used the longitudinal aspects of the HRS data to group participants into these different retirement trajectories or different work patterns, and they examined two specific psychological variables, cognitive ability, as well as the big 5 personality traits, to look at those as predictors of these different retirement patterns. And the findings, although this is a one bullet, does not really fully adequately summarize all the work that Susann and her colleagues went to in doing this work, but that cognitive ability and personality factors were indeed related to these different trajectories. So it's nice to see attention to the psychological factors in addition to health, in addition to wealth, and many other factors that relate to this complex process that is retirement and this ever-changing process given non-traditional retirement patterns and so forth. As a psychologist, I couldn't be happier to see more attention to these psychological factors. It was a strength in the study that the authors used the HRS data, and it's a strength for many reasons. First of all, it's a longitudinal panel study so that you can look at these patterns over time. Secondly, it has the opportunity of being a large nationally representative sample for being able to look at this, to be able to even make the data adjustments that the authors did and still have a sample size over 2,500 people is quite remarkable. And also the HRS has included a broad array of variables that makes research like this possible, to including account for a number of the covariates that were in the study. It was the strength of the work that they considered the various patterns and the fact that not everybody retires in the same way, although the majority, or it wasn't even the majority of people, but the largest percentage of patterns was 37% that engage in what we classify as traditional retirement, but still 37% isn't even half of the sample that was considered. So it was great that they looked at those different patterns. In addition, they considered a number of different variables that we know are related to retirement: labor market factors, health factors, economic factors, and so forth. And so there was really thorough consideration given to those many different factors. And the discussion of the paper, and I had the benefit of reading the full paper, not just the digested version of the slides that were just presented, but in the paper, the authors provided a very interesting discussion of the policy implications and what this might mean. That said, in the paper, the authors asked the question, why might psychological factors be related to retirement? And in many of our psychological papers, they usually begin with really long introductions, really rich and dense with a lot of theory. And although I found the model that was depicted in the paper to be very well thought out and very intuitive, it would really benefit from being more grounded in some of the psychological theory of why some of these factors, and in particular cognitive ability and personality, are likely related to preferences, related to shocks and so forth, that might mediate the relation to retirement trajectories. In 2011, Dan Feldman and Terry Beer wrote an excellent review paper in which they focused on the retirement decision-making process, and they reviewed a number of psychological theories that might explain why people retire in the manner in which they do, and took into account increasing prevalence of the phenomenon of bridge employment and so forth. So I would encourage the authors to consider this review and to consider these different theories. One in particular that makes a lot of sense in considering cognitive ability and personality is the notion of person-environment fit, or PE fit, or person-job fit, which simply just refers to the extent to which a worker and the tasks or demands that the worker is asked to do really are compatible with the worker's abilities as well as their interests. And that one particular framework might serve well for providing a context and a background for the conceptual model. Another aspect of psychological theory that is certainly relevant is work motivation. And in graduate school, I took an entire course just on the topic of work motivation. I can't do it in 2 minutes here, but suffice it to say that why people work is a complex process, and it can even vary within people over time as people's goals and motivations change and so forth. And lastly, there is quite a bit of additional psychological research, even some of which that has considered examining personality in the retirement process, and I indicate a couple references here as well. So just broadly speaking, to integrate the findings in the paper a little bit more with some of the extant literature. I understand that the authors age-adjusted the cognitive scores among the HRS participants between the ages of 50 to 61. They treated cognitive ability as a stable characteristic. I don't want to turn the rest of this afternoon into a debate of whether cognition is stable or not stable, but just want to remind everybody that we think of cognitive ability, in particular the GF, the fluid cognitive abilities, as something that does decline over time, and therefore the extent to which, at least in the paper, it was operationalized as a stable characteristic just doesn't give us quite the opportunity to look at within people over time and how those changes in cognitive abilities might relate to those retirement patterns. So even understanding, if anything, looking at cognitive ability based on the way cognition was operationalized in the study, between the ages of 50 to 61, there's likely to be less variability between people and within people over time than if we were to take a within subjects approach. Furthermore, the extent to which people have high levels of cognitive ability is likely to dictate the types of jobs that we choose. And one of the findings across expected retirement, actual retirement, and so forth, cognitive ability, more so than some of the personality factors, was one characteristic that was really consistently related to the outcomes of interest in the study. But just to note in the discussion of the paper that occupational choice wasn't considered and should be mentioned. And specifically, what I mean is that workers with higher levels of ability may have chosen different jobs, and working in those types of jobs might be more conducive to remaining in the workforce longer. There's probably a reason we see professors and academicians and people doing the kind of work we do easily working until their mid-70s, or at least at ISR at Michigan, people in their 90s that still come to work every day, Bob Kahn and a number of others. But yet I can think of physically demanding jobs and other jobs where you're not likely to see people in their mid-70s to mid-90s still working. And although the authors controlled for occupation and some job characteristics in the study, consistent with John Carr and Bob Willis's paper that Bob presented earlier this afternoon, it would be useful if there would be an opportunity to control for occupational or job complexity in the paper as well. So in general, there was the finding that there was a higher prevalence. So included in the results that Susann showed, and she presented a lot of data in a short amount of time, and she mentioned the fact that there were a number of workers who were engaged in part-time work. And in the full paper, there were some excellent tables that depicted the characteristics and those relations. And in fact, being more extroverted was associated with being more likely to engage in part-time work. However, there might be something fundamentally different about the nature of part-time work, and it could be the extent to which people are more likely to work in the service sector and the transportation sector, as explained in the full version of the paper, could simply just be a reflection of the fact that those are the types of jobs that are most readily available for people to work part-time, especially among people in their late 50s and 60s and so forth. And so one policy implication is that to the extent that people would prefer part-time work arrangements and bridge jobs where they can only work where they might prefer to work part-time, is to expand the offerings of part-time work outside of a higher likelihood of just the service sector and the transportation sector. Couple just limitations of the paper that should be noted in the full version of the paper. Although the results were statistically significant and, at least in my opinion, quite interesting, some of the effects based on the R-squares were rather small, and wondering then what the implications are for policy if we're talking about relatively small effect sizes in terms of cognitive ability and personality predicting these outcomes. And lastly, there were a few points at which the author, Susann, in her presentation mentioned, for example, that having cognitive ability makes people more likely to have certain retirement patterns. And some of the paper was written in a way that implied causality, but just reminding all of us that what we're doing is looking at correlational research over time, but that we're not truly able to infer cause and effect in the relations with these data. Just a few other bigger picture recommendations. Consistently, we talk about working longer, and I was certainly reminded by reviewers in a paper that I just submitted that really being clear about what we mean by working longer is important, especially as the age of eligibility for full Social Security benefits changes with age and so forth. In this paper, the authors looked at age 65 and the likelihood of working beyond 65 as the interpretation of working longer, but that may shift as well as we move on to additional cohorts. Generally speaking, the paper could be strengthened by devoting a little bit more attention to the construct validity of cognitive ability. And what I mean by that is that we've seen a couple papers today that have operationalized fluid cognitive abilities in the HRS using a 27-item measure in the HRS, which includes that word recall test of the number of words people can recall, as well as adding to that backwards counting and serial sevens. Paper that I worked on with Jack McCardle, Fisher, and Cadlick that was published in 2007 showed, in fact, that episodic memory and word recall are empirically a bit distinct from serial sevens and backwards counting. The correlation is 0.58. So on one hand, they're certainly highly related, but conceptually and empirically, there's evidence that those measures actually constitute different aspects of cognitive functioning. And so if we want to understand at a fundamental level what's going on with cognitive ability that relates to these trajectories, one possibility would just be to separate out those different measures and look and see if there are differences. And secondly, to the extent that cognitive ability is operationalized as a stable characteristic, one additional thing that can be done with the data is to look at the crystallized intelligence dimension using vocabulary scores, which tends to decline less with age, and see if that explains important variability, perhaps even above and beyond the fluid cognitive abilities in explaining people working over time. This paper focused primarily on between-person changes in relation, but also future work could be done to look at within-person changes in cognitive ability over time. There's also recent research by Brent Roberts and others that show that even personality tends to change among older adults, not to any great extent and not to the extent that cognitive ability does, but even if subtle changes in personality might explain differences in these different work and retirement patterns. So bottom line recommendations that I have are just to further integrate the results in the discussion with the extant literature and psychological factors, addressing the issue of possible selection bias due to occupational choice with regard to cognitive ability, controlling for job complexity. Susann indicated and perhaps knew that I was going to talk about some additional personality variables. A couple that are certainly available in the HRS data that could be examined include positive affectivity and negative affectivity, which I imagine are highly correlated with the neuroticism scale, but would also offer a different conceptualization of personality to look at people who generally view the world more positively or more negatively. And certainly there are a number of other psychological factors that could be examined in future research. And another suggestion is to consider other definitions of bridge employment, such as the distinction between people who are in bridge jobs within the same career or same type of work versus other types of work, as well as people who move on to self-employment later on. So recently, some colleagues and I, Dory Chaffee and Amanda Soniga and I, developed a model of retirement timing in which we thoroughly reviewed a lot of literature across multiple disciplines and at multiple levels. I don't expect that anyone can read all the fine print on there, so just want to point out that in this model, we conceptualized antecedents regarding whether people retire early, what we might think of as on time based on policy with Social Security, or later. Consequences of when people retire, and then certain factors that serve to moderate that relation in terms of the form of retirement, which the author studied, and so forth. So in their paper, they focused primarily on personality as individual factors, and so that you can see that, I just took that one box from the previous slide and expanded it here and highlighted in red the cognitive functioning and personality that was examined in the present paper. But also list here a number of other individual factors that could be considered. The physical health status and economic status and demographic characteristics were certainly already accounted for in serving the role of covariates or control variables in the analysis of their paper. But there are a number of other psychological variables that could be considered in future research, including motivation, needs, and values based on what I indicated about work motivation, considering preferences for retirement, as well as attitudes toward aging and retirement or attitudes toward work in general. So for example, the extent to which people really identify with their work role or have a high level of what we call work centrality. Again, making the distinction as Susann and others have indicated, the notion of some people live to work, others work to live, and the fact that not a lot of people are like us where they get necessarily as much enjoyment out of the work that they do. And taking into account subjective life expectancy as well as role identity and other factors. There are certainly other psychological factors that could be considered, but these are ones that have certainly been studied in prior research and have been shown to be related to retirement timing. Just some references, and lastly, but very briefly, just want to let all of you know that there's a new journal that just began this year called Work, Aging, and Retirement. for whom the editor is Mo Wong at the Warrington School of Business at the University of Florida. It's a journal that's very open to work on the topic of aging and retirement from multiple disciplines, and so I just wanted to let you all know about that if you weren't aware of it as a possible outlet for your work. Thank you.
Do I get to respond for a second? First of all, thank you, Gwen. Second of all, thank you, John, for this perfect match of a discussant. And the second comment is, would you please send me your slides?
Certainly.
And otherwise, not really much to add. The one thing that we, in this really first exploratory work of this topic for us anyways, was to maybe start out with partly, can be arguably, time invariant psychological factors. And if we are allowed to take that as a first approximation, then we had sort of also with Peter and Andy these discussions, okay, what does causality mean then? If we, again, for a moment get away with saying there is a cognitive ability component that sort of ranks us all, and say personality traits that are after people who reach young adulthood are fairly stable, then these are the things that indeed determine in a major manner job choice. And so we controlled safer occupation not in a full way, and more can be done, but in terms of the causality discussion, we're thinking, well, in that case then, all of these things sort of shape these things and are where then occupation is more a mechanism through which it's changed. So not necessarily sort of something that's in addition, but actually sort of a channel. But that's up for debate, and so this about that, and then otherwise all of your points are very well taken. Again, to then get to time-varying psychological factors, many of which you mentioned, of course then we have to take quite a different analytical approach as well, and which future work should do, and all of those are great ideas. Thank you very much.
Perhaps to the extent it didn't really come across as strongly as it should have, your paper was incredibly well done, and it was my privilege to have the opportunity to read it. So thank you.
Thank you, Susann. I think it's great. It's wonderful to see a broader range of psychological constructs being included in this work. I have a range of things. Let me start by, I think it's very crucial to clarify which notion of personality you want to work with. There is the psychometric tradition that has brought to us these wonderful measurements that have relatively high reliability given the complexity of the constructs that they measure. However, they have also come with a problem, and that is their theory, because basically they don't have a theory. They were created by going through a dictionary and selecting all the adjectives that describe people, and then these, I forgot what the startup number was, 500 adjectives or something, were given to samples after samples and samples. And then they were boiled down, and then one put them into factor analysis after factor analysis and came up with the big five. And then Costa and McRae came along and said, these are cast in stone. This is our individuality. This is what a person is, okay? It's the contrast theory, which is really a theory and not empirically driven, is the notion that what makes up personality is habituated patterns of perception and reaction to environments. And people can be distinguished according to the styles by which, the kinds of which they typically perceive and then react. Now, if you adopt that notion of personality, you have a built-in dynamic. It is not saying that we are like swaying like a grass in the wind because it's habituated, okay? So there is some stability to that, but there is also systematic reaction to environments, and who wouldn't expect that? It would be completely dysfunctional if we were constructed such that we could not take into account changing incentive patterns around us, changing interrelationships around, and so forth. So after, I would say it started in the 90s, in the 1990s, that even Costa himself used the Duke longitudinal study. They had 7-year intervals, and they published the first paper in a pretty obscure, I mean, it's sort of like buried, it wasn't in the main journal. They found major changes in people who had experienced divorce in the, between the two measurement points of 7 years. And then there were very interesting gender effects, sort of like that men had to suffer much more with divorce than women. Actually, women got stronger after divorce and so forth. So, but that aside, I'm just saying. So there are important life events. I think you had a different term you meant, you said life something, you had a, whatever. That have been, shocks, right, that have been shown to affect the ways people perceive and react. And I find it sad in a way to average between your two, I realize you only have 2 time points for personality, but to basically fold in the second measurement into the first, I think is giving away something. I would not suggest, I would not recommend to do that. Second thing, obviously we have mean level stability and we have rank order stability. And we know the mean level stability in both cognition and personality is much smaller than the rank order. But the interesting thing is, within rank order, cognition is much, 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 much higher than personality. The rank order stability of the big 5, in my mind, is interpreting a glass half full or half empty, because it is half of the variance stays stable, half of the variance changes. And so I think it's not state-of-the-art personality research to say there's nothing going on and let's just use this as whatever the color of the eyes or something, you know, to make a biological comparison. So anyway, so I thought that would be very nice. The second point I wanted to make was there are some interventions done on personality. One has come out of my lab, and we have focused on openness to new experience, because openness to new experience shows in midlife, around 50, age 50, a decline. It continues to increase up to age 50, and then it shows a moderate decline, much smaller than the mechanics or the fluid intelligence, but nevertheless sizable. And so we said, does that have to be that way? I mean, people always say, well, that's a normal reaction. You know, at one point you've seen it all, you know it all. Why would you need to have yet something new? So we took advantage of a quasi-experiment where we could show that people that were exposed to certain training measures before they entered into new environments, actually they got addicted. And we had an upward spiral on openness in people age 60 and above. However, the ones, a control group on a waiting list, who had not yet received that training, nothing was happening. So I'm just saying there's a start on these types of interventions, and yeah, anyway, but congratulations. I'm very happy to see that kind of work.
Well, thank you. I'm just so grateful to be able to get all this feedback. This work is fresh off the press. I would call it our first scratch at the surface of what is certainly for us a new topic. And so I'm just most grateful for giving more lectures so we can get this to the right level and treat these things, these measures, and do them justice, really. Thanks so much.